So this is the third lecture on Ecce Homo, where we're going to really look at the concept of Nietzsche as educator. We need then to understand what it means to become Nietzsche. Nietzsche, as we've said, is writing Ecce Homo in an attempt to show how he has become the person he has become. So what has he become? Well, he's become someone who has an intellectual freedom. We talked in the last lecture about how he sees his role in unmasking Christianity as demonstrating his ability to be open to ideas. So we have a quote here which sums up part of his feelings, where he says, "How much truth can a spirit bear? How much truth can a spirit dare? That became for me more and more the real measure of value." So he sees value in challenging the spirit, in achieving that freedom. So what does it require? Well, some of the things that he says that it requires are necessity, self-preservation, and of course that phrase amor fati, which we shall talk about a little bit more. So starting then with the concept of becoming necessary. Nietzsche wants us to be more than just chance. He wants us to be necessary. And we have a quote here from a paper by Acampora, which says, "Becoming what one is involves becoming a necessity." And this is how Nietzsche depicts himself in his work. Becoming necessary for Nietzsche is a form of freedom because it entails becoming capable, becoming enabled, activated, enlivened. So with this idea of becoming necessary, we come back to what Nietzsche says before about rejecting being passive, being active. Nietzsche also focuses on the concept of self-preservation, and this is what he sees as a need to nurture the self and defend it. And if we think back to what we've read before about Nietzsche and selfishness, this very much fits in with a lot of his other arguments. We have a quote here. He says, "In all this, in selection of nutriment, of place and climate, of recreation, there commands an instinct of self-preservation which manifests itself most unambiguously as an instinct for self-defense." So what Nietzsche is saying here is that we do need to defend ourselves from things which are damaging to us, that are damaging to our growth as individuals. And we have a quote here from Acampora again, which says, "This self-such, self-seeking, is not simply self-absorption or withdrawal, but rather is a form of storing up for the purpose of enhancing expressive capacities and sharing them with others." So this is not necessarily a purely selfish thing to do. It's the idea of trying to preserve oneself so that one is more valuable. Nietzsche, of course, also talks about amor fati, and this is in some ways quite a simple concept of loving one's fate. And this again goes back to other ideas that Nietzsche has put forward in other books. Particularly, we might want to remember the eternal recurrence, or even his idea of the Oberman, who embraced life, embraced this life. And as always, we have a quote from Nietzsche to support this, where he says, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be other than it is, not in the future, not in the past, not in all eternity, not merely to endure, but to love it." And so, as we've said, this goes back to that idea of the eternal recurrence, that the ideal man for Nietzsche would not reject the idea of living their life over and over and experiencing it over and over again, but would embrace it, that would be able to see it as a positive thing. So these elements then help for Nietzsche to sum up some of what he sees as being necessary in preparing ourselves. This brings us on to an overreaching theme of Ecce Homo, and indeed much of Nietzsche's works, which is where Nietzsche sees himself in some ways as possibly having an educator role or linked to educator. Now, Nietzsche was actually interested in education. He wrote, of course, Schopenhauer as educator, and he also wrote some lectures on the future of our educational institutions. The theme of education also comes up in works such as Human or Too Human and The Gay Science, and Nietzsche was very critical of the education available. He didn't think that it was really fulfilling what was needed from education. And Nietzsche's interest in education is part of why he is so proud of Zarathustra. We know that he sees Thus Spoke Zarathustra as an important work. And it's not just that he thinks that it is a particularly brilliant piece of work, but it's about the role that he sees it having. It is part of his underlying ideas about education. And of course, Ecce Homo, with its discussion of how one becomes what one is, and Behold the Man, is part of this ongoing conversation about education. He's looking to be part of that. So what does Nietzsche see the role as the educator as being? Well, Nietzsche does not think that a good teacher should simply instruct others. He wants to see an educator as an example, not an instructor. There would be aspects to be emulated and admired, but there wouldn't be rules to be followed. He doesn't want to give us specific instructions, despite the fact that actually he does provide specific instructions, such as saying that reading a book first thing in the morning is vicious. He actually does want us to find rules for ourselves. And again, we can go back to his ideas that he put forward when he talked about the death of God, that he didn't want us to look to Christian morality. He wanted us to create our own values. Well, in terms of becoming who we can become, Nietzsche at least pays some service to the idea that we should be creating our own way of doing this. So these are standards to be raised rather than presenting specific ideas. And we have a quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra where he says, "One repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil." And again, we'll have a quote from a paper which discusses Nietzsche's role as an educator from Schwartz, where he said, so in Schopenhauer's educator, Nietzsche celebrates Schopenhauer as his educator without even discussing any of Schopenhauer's views. So Nietzsche doesn't feel that you necessarily have to agree with someone's views to learn something from them. So why should we look to Nietzsche as an example? Why would Nietzsche see himself in that particular role? Well, of course, Nietzsche believes that by unmasking Christianity, he's managed to show us something about how we should revalue our values. And we have a number of quotes from Nietzsche here. He says, "And that is in fact my insight. The teachers, the leaders of mankind, theologians included, have also one and all been decadents. Thence the revaluation of all values into the imical of life, thence morality." So he's saying that it's his insight that has been important. And I'm going to come back to a quote that we used in the last lecture where he says, "The unmasking of Christian morality is an event without equal, a real catastrophe. He who exposes it is a force majeure, a destiny. He breaks the history of mankind into two parts." And this is what he's saying about himself, that he has been important because he has unmasked Christian morality, and that's why he is an example for us. Now, Ansel Persson, in his book on how to read Nietzsche, says Nietzsche construes himself as a destiny because he holds himself to have unmasked Christian morality in terms of an event that is without equal and a real catastrophe. So again, it's this idea that his unmasking of Christianity is what makes him important and an example for us. As we've seen, this does not mean that Zarathustra is a prophet. Neither Nietzsche or Zarathustra are, as far as Nietzsche is concerned, are prophets. He said, "You had not yet sought yourselves when you found me. Thus do all believers. Therefore all belief is of so little account. Now I bid you lose me and find yourselves, and only when you have all denied me will I return to you." And that is, of course, a quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, from Zarathustra. And it's back to this idea that Nietzsche does not want us to just be pupils. We need to find our own values. And we might be reminded of the tightrope walker who falls and dies. And Zarathustra says to him that he does not need to fear hell because he is able to look to this life. And that means reevaluating his own values. Who then is the educator? Well, we might argue, as Schwartz does, that neither Zarathustra nor Nietzsche were actually the educators, in that neither of them see themselves as people to necessarily follow. They might inspire us, but they are not giving us rules and ways of living. And again, we have a quote from Schwartz which said, "But who or what is the educator here? Neither Zarathustra nor even Nietzsche himself at the outset, for both themselves had much to learn. The real educator, I suggest, is neither of them, but rather the work itself." So we have to ask ourselves whether Nietzsche really succeeds. And we'll go to Ansel Pearson here, who says, "It could be suggested that in speaking in this way, Nietzsche is at war with himself. We have to renounce so many things, and yet we have to still believe in so many things. We have to give up on our ideals, and yet we are to set ourselves new tasks." So there are conflicts here. On one hand, Nietzsche wants us to do a reevaluation of our values. If Christian morality is dead, then we need to consider what our new morality is. But even in suggesting that, he is giving us suggestions, he is giving us rules to possibly follow. So there are conflicts here. As we come to the end of Ecce Homo then, what we might come back to is back to Dionysus, who for Nietzsche is of course still an important influence. And again, Dionysus is not a teacher for Nietzsche. He's not giving him rules, but he is inspiring him. He is someone who Nietzsche looks to for helping him reshape that revaluation of values. So possibly we might argue that Dionysus is Nietzsche's educator. And again, we'll come back to this quote from Nietzsche. "Have I been understood? Dionysus against the crucified."